Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this mini-series. This is the 5th installment of 6, so we're almost to the end. Thank you for hanging in there. Today, we're going to talk about the why, and I will give you a full disclosure. This is maybe the 3rd time I've recorded the podcast. The first time I recorded it, I edited so much that it just didn't make sense anymore. And I think that just underscores how difficult this can be to talk about. Like, well, is there a real why? And it's so individualized. And so I'm going to actually re-record it a 3rd time. And I hope this one actually makes sense, because I can tell when I read it back to myself that it doesn't make any sense. I'm going to add the next to worst edit at the end of the podcast, just in case you like to listen. But let me just revisit. We've already talked about a couple things, so I'm going to throw those in here. I think if we think of the why, it's a series of ingredients. And if you just looked at everybody's different ingredient lists, it varies how much of each thing. Obviously, we have a thought that motivates an action. So if you are flying out of town to help somebody, if you are on the phone arranging a caregiver, or if you're actively trying to avoid getting caught up or looped into something, whatever your actions are, there's a thought or a feeling that precedes that. And sometimes when we get really busy, we just kind of end up in a lot of action, and we're doing action all the time. And it can be really difficult to get still for a second and try to understand what's actually happening there. And I would encourage you, in a topic as big as aging parents and as complicated as the emotions and pressures can be, that actually might be a good spot in your life to sit down and do some sort of exercise to get clear on your why. And I say that because the why really dictates the energy of the ecosystem, or at least your portion of the ecosystem that you're participating in. If the why comes from a lot of obligation or guilt, it's just like anything else in life. You kind of bring that into your energy in the way that you are participating. So for instance, if I've gotten roped into PTA projects that I don't really want to be a part of, and I betray myself by agreeing to do something I don't really want to do, and then I show up and I can feel myself trying to overcome the native or latent energy that is, I really can't afford to do this, or I don't want to do this right now, or I'm really uncomfortable. And so no judgment on that. I think you always have to push yourself, and sometimes your value system will override your comfort system and you just do things. But the idea is, when you take a moment to examine the why and then recommit to the why, that can actually change your energy level going into it. That might help improve how sustainable the situation is. And so a lot of times we think, well, the way that the situation is going to get better is it just needs to get better. That person needs to not have as many needs, or I need to have more time or more money or whatever it is. And maybe all those are true, but on a couple things that we can really modify, maybe in an afternoon of reflection or thinking, that is actually accessible to us to really get clear. And you have to sort of approach it, in my mind, from an I don't know starting. I don't know why I do this. Well, okay, let's not accept that I don't know, but let's start at I don't know. So what I like to do, and I know we've talked about this many times before, is ask 3rd and 4th order questions of the brain. And you have to be almost like a journalist going into your own brain and saying, why do we do this? Why are we participating in this way? Maybe it's donating time. Maybe it's helping to be part of doctor's appointments or whatever it is. And you can ask your brain, why are we doing this? I want to share with you 3 answers you should never accept from your brain. Okay. Number 1 is because. Just like from a kid, if you ask them a question and then their answer is because, that's not actually an answer. And I'm not even a teacher, but I could imagine it would drive me crazy if the next answer to everything was always because. So that is sort of the lazy part of the brain, just wanting to give you an answer. It works in some situations. It's going to propose that. And that, to me, is usually a cover for a much deeper discussion that probably needs to happen. So if I say, why do you brush your teeth? And you say, because I don't want to have cavities and dental procedures. Okay. The brain didn't have to just say because it's really confident and it's really clear to the brain why you brush your teeth. You probably maybe learned that, I don't know, in your younger elementary years, maybe earlier than that. And that's been the answer in the brain. There isn't a lot that's going to change that answer in the brain. And that's why it comes so readily. But if I say, why am I participating in this care ecosystem, even if it's causing me distress? And you get because, like, that's strike one, okay? Now, the next one is really sneaky. It sounds like a great answer, but I'm going to try to convince you that it's not. The next thing is, why am I participating in this care ecosystem? And the answer might be because it's the right thing to do. And I know you've heard interviews that we've done on this podcast where that is basically the first line of defense of the brain, because it's the right thing to do. And ever since you're a kid, you want your kids to think, well, what's the right thing to do? And basically follow that. And I'm not debating or trying to say that that isn't a good reason to do something because it's the right thing to do. I want to focus in on who and how it was determined what was right. Because the word right is the tricky part of that answer, because it was the right thing to do. That's why we're not going to accept that as a full answer. Why is it the right thing to do? And that's when you're going to get better into those third and fourth order questions. So remember, we don't accept because. The second is we don't accept because it's the right thing to do, right? And the third one, oh man, I hate it when my brain says this. And you should never accept this, okay, is because we have to. And I'm not saying that you don't have to. Like if I say, why do you brush your teeth? And you say, but I have to. Okay, perhaps that's true. I mean, there are people that don't, but like there's no growth in that answer because I have to. And honestly, it just feels icky to just say it because I have to. Like, that's not a great answer either. I don't feel good about that. I don't feel good about that for anything. And so if we were talking about the dental care, you'd say, because I have to avoid future costs and pain related to dental disease. And you're like, oh, okay, that sounds great. Because at the end of the day, at the core of almost everything we do, right, is avoidance of pain or avoidance of discomfort and the seeking of how we think it will make us feel. Okay, that's a lot of information. And I'm talking from the brain perspective, okay, which is the vast majority of our thoughts and actions are in one of two directions: avoiding pain and discomfort, or doing something because of how we think it might make us feel. And when it comes to aging parents, right, those are both very relevant. So remember, we're not going to accept the first order answers from the brain if that's what your brain is producing. And so when I say get still and think about this, I want you to interrogate your own brain as if you were going to write an award-winning, highly paid article about why this brain is thinking and acting this way. Not because you want to change it. You do not have to query the brain about why you're doing something with the intent to change it, because you can have a couple of different options, right? You can actually recommit to what you're doing right now. But I will tell you, if you go through a period of examination and reflection and then recommit to the thing you're already doing, the energy that you bring to what you're already doing can improve. And nothing else had to change but your own mind. And so one of the things I want to reinforce is in dealing with aging parents, there are so many things we can't control. I mean, God knows that, right? We can't control when bad things happen or disease progression for the most part. We can't control their behavior. We can't control time. We can't control our own aging. And so if you let go of all these things that are clearly beyond our control, and if you have an effort meant to exercise control in those areas, then you're likely delusional. Then I have to retreat back to what are some basic things I can control. And that's why I probably spend so much time in my own head, constantly cleaning and reorganizing my own brain, because it's actually one of the few things that I can change and in relatively short order. And I've been practicing this type of, I call it thought management, for a long time, because it is one of the only levers that I have. And seeing a lot of very difficult situations just in my own clinical life or my personal life, it is my go-to coping mechanism. And I'm not great at it yet, but I am going to share a lot of using those types of tools to really examine the why. Now, of course, I'm talking about aging parents. You could take the same approach and do it for just about anything. But in that exercise where I'm getting quiet and still and asking my brain for better answers, which is really what we're doing here, you'd be surprised what bubbles up. And I would say, remember, you're taking like the journalist perspective, let it bubble up. Let whatever's going to come up. Because if there's something down in there somewhere, like I have to, because I would be a bad daughter or a bad insert whatever religion your family might be a part of, or my husband wouldn't respect me, or my kids wouldn't help me when I was older. And again, these will come up without judgment. You're not looking for like good thoughts and bad thoughts. You just want to be there to open the door to see what's going to come out of that closet, right? So you don't want to leave that just sort of stacked up in there and assuming whatever's in the closet is what needs to be there. And so really getting more clear about your why can be helpful. And that's when it's almost like dumping out a purse and then kind of looking through it and then reorganizing it and put things back in the purse, okay? And so once we're in that space, when we're allowing our brain to actually surface up, why we're doing this, we want to kind of gather those thoughts as if they were like little stickies, right? And write them down. And once we've gotten out of the question and answer phase, we're going to ask the brain a different question, okay? Let me start with some thoughts that might bubble up about why you would help care for an aging parent. Maybe it's because you feel emotionally bonded to them and that you feel like that is part of your cultural or religious tradition and that's something you want to honor that's really important to you. Maybe it's part of just avoiding institutional care, all the costs and all the drama associated with that. Maybe it's just part of flexibility and control, like when you're living next to them or living with them, that you just have some more ability to help somebody, but also not have to travel really far to help them. Maybe having them live with you is part of a shared household benefit, like it was for me and my grandmother living here. She moved in when my twins were 18 months old and moved out when they were 9. So there were a lot of times where my husband and I had to be gone in a pinch, and she was the designated adult. And I always thought, well, the police show up, there's an adult here, even if the adult's 87. Like, I'm probably not going to make it into the papers because there is somebody here. And I don't mean to diminish a lot of other things that she did and brought so much kindness and love and history into our home. But just as an example, there may be other shared benefits, even if it's just historical. Maybe it's just you being in touch with your family or your past or your origins, whatever that is, right? Now, I say all of these like as if they should just be completely neutral stickies. I'm not saying one of these reasons is any better or worse than the other. The next order question is going to be, but do I like my reasons? I love, 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 love that question. Because your brain will think, I gave you all the reasons that we do this and we're good. Okay. It just washes its hands of it and walks away. And I'm like, no, come back to the table, brain. No, not done yet. At first, you didn't really give me an answer. And then I pushed and then you gave me a whole bunch of answers. And now I want to go through and decide whether or not I like these reasons. It's when you find the discrepancy between where you find that gap of things that your brain has offered as reasons, and then whether or not you like those reasons, those are two different questions. And that's where you start to see the change. Like, these sound like great reasons to do something. They're just thoughts. They're just sticky notes, right? Your true self, your values, your consideration of everything else going on in your life and all the competing demands on your time and your resources, then you start to say, you know what? I really don't like that reason, right? And that is what's going to help you kind of get down into the core part of why you're doing something and then continue to do it because you like those reasons. or get down to the core part of why you're doing something and decide you don't like those reasons and then change it. So whatever is coming up, that's where that agreement, that's where that energy is going to come from, is really finding all of the reasons that feel native and organic to you and your value system. So you can find there's a hack here, right? So if you're doing something really difficult, which caring for an aging parent can be extremely difficult and challenging, and you've decided you're committed for all the things we've talked about that you're going to do this. On the contrary, if you've just decided for all of the above reasons that you're going to do something, one of the hacks, one of the workarounds is to work backwards from that. And you say, look, I know that this is the thing we're going to do. I have 25 different reasons to do them. Is you go through and pull out the strongest reasons that resonate the best, that are most close to your own sort of native organic value system, and really focus on those and even have those written down. These are the 5 reasons that I do this. And emphasize those in your own story about yourself and about how and why you're participating in this, and maybe even talk about it in front of your kids. These are the reasons. I mean, obviously they're watching everything we do and learning from that. And so articulating that and finding reasons that feel real to you. Because I can tell you the energy behind, I do this because I have to. Like, you've been around people who are at events that they don't want to be at, or that are doing something because they feel guilted into it and it just doesn't feel good. And unfortunately, the person that's on the receiving end of the care, it's not like they don't pick up on that, right? And so if I do this a lot with my kids, even on a daily basis, I'm not bringing my best attitude and self to something and they can pick up on it faster than I do, is I have my go-to reasons in my head of why it's important to stop my mental drama and be present at that moment. But I have to have that sort of built in. Like, it's almost like I have to have buttons to deploy in my own head to bring me back into what I feel like is important. And part of that is just sort of understanding you have this larger self that's looking out for the important things in life. And that's in a very different part of the brain than the part of our brain that gets really distracted and bogged down and overthinking things. And so I always have to have sort of this parachute to myself of, look, Athena's right in front of you, and we're going to have this conversation right now. Of course, she likes to do that when I'm recording my podcast, and I don't always stop the podcast and do that. But in general, I have my own kind of parachute buttons. And so it just gets me out of whatever mental funk that I get in. And really this whole exercise of kind of questioning the brain and becoming a journalist and getting down, what you want to come up with is almost like I said, 4 or 5 buttons you can deploy or stickies you want to stick inside the brain, or even physically write down and put in your office or your wallet or something like that. And that is what can help recenter the brain when things get really difficult or demanding. And those 5 or 6 reasons don't even have to be all in support of, okay, do the absolute most that you possibly can. It could be reminders of how limited your own time is, or maybe your own health is, or maybe your own commitments to other people like neighbors or your children or your career or whatever that is. And so getting that and kind of helping the brain balance that, I think, can be really helpful. And let me go through the exercise in the opposite direction. There are also a lot of reasons you might not be in the care ecosystem. And I know we've mentioned them before, including, awful things like trauma or abuse. And I think those are obvious, but some more, nuanced issues could be your own physical mobility challenges, your own physical limitations. Maybe you have a bad shoulder or a bad back that might make it difficult to provide personal care for somebody. Your own time constraints, your own financial constraints. Maybe you're working 2 jobs right now to try to get your kid through college or whatever's going on. You might have your own strained relationships in your own nuclear family, right? So your own marriage or your relationships with your teenagers or college age kids that you need to really be present for or work on. And so you're the only person that's aware, painfully, right? Is how I feel like it, of every demand, everywhere you're falling short, everywhere that you're doing okay at all times. Like I had a dashboard in my head. It's just always on. And I feel like because I'm the only person that has that bird's eye view, maybe because I'm the only person that knows the sum total, then it's my responsibility to also find places where I can support myself and just understand that there is a finite zero-sum allocation of my time, resources, and attention. And sometimes when I get to the bottom of asking the brain why or why not I'm participating or helping with something, that can be really reassuring to me, like, well, I can only do so much. That sounds kind of fatalistic, but it's true. There's only so much we can do. And so other reasons that your brain might propose is just geographic distance. Well, that makes sense, right? So kind of looping back to what we talked about in the who, obviously affection has a lot to do with it. I won't go over all that again. That was like my second edit was talking way too much about that. But affection, especially if there's a lot of positive affection towards somebody, just think of it, it's like greasing the skids. I mean, it just makes things easier. You can come up with a whole lot more reasons that the brain wants to do something. Or duty. That's where I think it's more tricky. And if you feel a high sense of duty because of extrinsic factors, because you feel pressured to do so, that you might be ostracized or othered or isolated because you are not living up to some pre-existing cultural or religious tradition, that's really hard. That is a super high burnout risk doing that. And that's where I would encourage you to get down into, what are the reasonings behind it? And you might even need even more culturally specific counseling or psychologist support that might be able to help untangle a lot of your own identity as being part of that tradition group, but then trying to square that with your current demands, or maybe even dealing with somebody or something that's just brought a lot of pain or trauma. I think that I'm doing some future podcasts on this topic, so I'll kind of leave it at that. But even when we talk about the duty scale, I would even subdivide that into your intrinsic duty of just how compelled you feel personally to participate, and then how much you feel compelled extrinsically or from the outside. And so that kind of makes up the why. So if you listen to this hoping I would tell you exactly why you should or shouldn't do something, I was like, that's not going to happen, right? You've listened to all the other podcasts. But I want to give you a structure and some practical tools as to how you would get even deeper into that conversation in your own brain. So I hope you found this was helpful. We have one more in the mini series, which is the how, and then we'll be done and move on to even more exciting things. So thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you so much for being here today. As I said before, I'm going to add one of the edits here at the very end. Please feel free to listen. Have a great rest of your week. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for sticking with me. We are in 5 of 6 of this series. Hopefully you've enjoyed it so far. Today, we're going to talk about the heavy, heavy topic, at least from a controversial perspective, which I think is the why. And I should have made it why or why not, right? So why you're going to support somebody else, or maybe even why not. I always want to make space for the whole spectrum of decision making and all the different outcomes. So we'll leave this with the why or why not you're going to be willing/able to care for somebody else, whatever that looks like. And we've already talked about different types of care or support that can be provided. The first thing I'm going to start with is the affection scale. I talked about it a bit in the podcast about who, but the affection scale is something that I just completely made up, but use it from a perspective of helping quantify or get our brain to understand the level of which we feel compelled towards supporting somebody because of how we feel about them. This is very individualized in that relationship, point A to point B, between two people. Maybe that person took you in when you needed help. Maybe that person taught you how to drive. Maybe they pitched in when you needed it the most. So even if you don't have somebody in your life that you would consider a 5 on the affection scale, maybe imagine them. Like, what would that look like? What would that feel like? And we're all very lucky and blessed if you have even one person as a 5 on the affection scale, and maybe multiple people. And then the negative scales are for issues with resentment, animosity, trauma, difficult, challenging personalities, all the way down to -5. For the affection scale, the higher the affection, usually the easier it is for this decision-making that we just talked about in the previous episodes. So if we define affection, there's lots of different definitions, but in general, it's like a feeling of fondness or warmth or attachment towards someone. High amounts of affection, high amounts of empathy or wanting the best for somebody. It can imply like closeness, caring, kindness, and even physical touch, like hugs, hand holding, verbal affirmation, thoughtful gestures. So that's affection. And obviously, people have different love languages and they can express affection in different ways. And you can hear in the way even somebody talks about another person, like a grandmother or an aunt. You can hear the affection even in their tone of voice and the adjectives they use. It's kind of intuitive, so I don't want to make it too complicated. I think affection drives either some of the satisfaction of helping care for somebody on the higher levels, and then some of the burnout and resentment on the lower levels. Now, of course, you can still experience a lot of burnout and frustration even with a high affection level, but just in general, you can already get to tell kind of the prognosis of the support situation when somebody has a lot of affection. So if I show up in a patient's room and, 5 family members have already shown up and they've already put pictures all over the wall and brought flowers, and like you could tell right away that this person has a lot of affection from a lot of different people in their life. That's a blessing and, definitely something that is a positive prognosis for their care ecosystem. For people that I've taken care of patient-wise that have almost an obvious negative affection, I will tell you it's really difficult to get a hold of anybody. And when you do get a hold of anybody, they'll say things like, "Please never call me again. I want nothing to do with this person." That happens too. Luckily, not as much as the positive affection, but it can happen. So that's one scale as to the why. So why may be, yes, that person, I am very close to them. They've been so kind to me throughout my lifetime. They've been so warm. They've been a safe space, and I want to provide that for them. That would be like an example on the higher end of the scale. And then on the bottom end of the scale, or the negative part of the scale, that person has created difficulty and trauma for me. I physically can't be around them. It's too difficult for my system. I get a high heart rate. I get sweaty. My stomach hurts. So -5 to +5, 0 being neutral. That's the first part of the why or why not. And then the second part of the why or why not is the duty scale. And we talked about that on a little bit different, which is like a 0 to 10. Let's just say 0 is indifferent or no feeling of duty, responsibility, or obligation. And then a 10 on that scale might be, this is my role. I was born to do this. Everything in my life has pointed towards this. I feel extremely committed and strong to caring for this person at all costs. And what's interesting, when I've done these interviews on the podcast, I've talked to people that I thought they think that they're a 10 on the duty scale, but I've always been able to find a boundary. Like, well, would you do this? Would you do that? Would you go this far? And there's a limit. I don't know that there's a whole lot of true 10s out there. Like, I'd quit my job, leave my family, and go move in with this person and care for them 24/7. It has happened. I'm aware of those types of cases, but for the majority, like 10 would be very rare and very destructive to other parts of your life. So think of it like on that scale. So 0, I feel no duty, obligation to participate in their care system. And then 10 is like what I just said. And I think most people, for most parents in which they have a decent or even healthy relationship, are somewhere in the middle. And the reason for that is it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And the reason I think kind of that 10 out of 10 on duty is rare is because there are other considerations in life, right? So a job, other kids, other health concerns for that person. It could be, I feel like I have a duty, but not at the expense of my own health or my own kids. Or, I feel like I have a duty, but I have met so many aging parents that say, no, I don't want to have that kind of relationship with my adult children. I don't want them coming to take care of me. Sure, I'd love to connect and visit with them, but I'd like to try to manage all of my care needs independent of my kids and leave that relationship to the being a child and a parent versus a caregiver. The example I gave in the other podcast was, say, like an old mentor or teacher or professor that you just loved. They changed your life. They mean everything to you. So you could have a high amount of affection, but feel no duty to participate in their care should something happen. 0 is like, I'm not on the list. Don't put me on the list. I don't want to be on the list. There's no reason to be on the list. And you pretty much have to drag me onto the list if that was going to happen. And even then, I won't go. And then 10 would be, yep, I anticipate I will drop everything, including my own obligations to my workplace or my family or myself, to go and help this person. So that I would call that nearly like malignant duty, right? Because that can be destructive to yourself and everything else around you. I have not seen this that often. There's probably some other deeper psychological reasoning for that. I am not judging it for being good or bad, but I want to make sure we make this a spectrum so you can understand where you fall. The vast majority of people aren't able/willing to drop everything and go provide 24-hour care to someone, maybe for short periods, but in general, like you don't really see that often. It's just not that practical. But the sense of duty, that's where I would score it out, right? So I think most people kind of end up in the middle range, like maybe a 4 to 7. I would consider 5 like average. Like, yeah, it's important for me to support this person. I would naturally expect myself to come to the hospital if I was able to help support them. What really pushes you up towards a 10 or makes it more difficult are the cultural or social or religious pressures. You might have a low amount of affection, but feel a very high sense of duty, not because of who that person is or how much time you want to spend with them, but because it's more extreme from, I don't want to be left out of this family circle. I don't want to be made fun of. I don't want to be shamed. I don't want to be made to feel like I'm inadequate or not enough or not doing enough. And so you might have different numbers on this duty scale for different reasons. It could just be intrinsic, meaning internal to you, like you've decided 0 to 10. Or it may be, look, if it was up to me, it would be a 0. But, cultural pressures have put me up at about a 6. Like I can't imagine not supporting them in some way because of how it would affect all of my other relationships. Or I would be pushed out of the family circle and I can't fathom that. And so I'm just going to do it, but out of duty. And on this particular aspect of the why, it can be very challenging to have a high duty score because of extrinsic reasons, not intrinsic, right? With a person that you have low affection for. So I think the worst case scenario is somebody who you have an intrinsic duty is none. I feel like no obligation to help them. You have an extrinsic pressure that kind of pushes that number up because of societal pressures or other things in a setting where you have very low or negative affection for that person. That is a really hard caregiving situation and can have high burnout and high potential for very draining and difficult experiences. And of course, the best case scenario is if you have somebody that's like a 5 on the affection scale, and then you have a lot of intrinsically motivated duty that pushes that number up intrinsically because you just feel that you want to be able to offer that. The why you would or would not help somebody, we talked about affection and duty. And then there's kind of an umbrella over it of just pragmatic considerations of, are you able? And so I think of like affection and duty as kind of willing, like what describes whether or not you're willing to take care of somebody. And the next filter setting is able. And so you might have high affection and a high sense of duty, but you may not be physically able to. You might be deployed somewhere. You might be taking care of your own child with chronic medical conditions. You might have your own chronic medical conditions independent of your affection and your duty. And then the why I'm doing it or why I'm not is a whole different level, right? Because maybe I can't, just not able to. Or maybe there's money that needs to be expended in this care situation and you have other financial considerations or other financial goals or other people depending on you. And you might decide, no, that's a boundary. I'm not going to spend money on this situation, but maybe I can help arrange this or help participate this way. And so the kind of why or why not, I feel like gets very personal very quickly, very individualized to certain situations. But the way I think about them is stepping through sort of the idea of affection and the component of that, the idea of duty, the component intrinsic duty, that's kind of your individual value system, and then extrinsic as well, which is the pressures on you to do or not do certain things. And then, of course, what supersedes all of that is just pragmatism. Like, are you able to or not? Or even if you're able to, do you have to make a different decision based on other factors in your life, like your career, your family, etc.? We'll get more into that when we talk about the how. That'll dive a little bit deeper. But as far as the why, I think there's an opportunity to go back and get more clear, especially if you're already in the caregiving situation, as to the whys, and examine those kind of with a neutral outlook. I think a lot of people, including myself, can rush into a situation like this and not really take some time to reflect. And I think in some ways it can be very positive, like kind of getting back to your why, getting back to your purpose, getting back to who you are and your true self. And that may, getting back to that may say, oh, I think I need to do more. I think I need to be more involved. And it might be, no, I think I need to spend more time paying attention to this other thing. And I'm going to have to find some ways to kind of back out or politely decline. Both directions are reasonable based on getting really true to yourself about why. And so if you're a person that likes to write, especially if you're already in a caregiving situation, I would encourage you to maybe think about the whys in terms of the affection, duty, and just overall ability to care for somebody, and reflect on that and see if you like those reasons. See if when you go through the whys, one of the most important questions when you decide why you're doing something, I love the second order question of, and do you like that reason? Because for me, if I'm doing something because, I don't know, there's cultural or societal pressure for me to do it, I just really don't like that reason. Like just in general, I'm like, oh, time out, like blinking red light. This is not a good situation because I don't like, no matter what I'm doing, if I'm doing it because I feel like something else made me do it. And that doesn't mean I stop doing it. It means I need to go back and find if there's some other intrinsic or internal reasons why I want to be doing this. And so I think that exercise is a free exercise to go through as long as you're open and authentic into understanding what is going to bubble up and what you're going to do with that information. And I think it can be very helpful because, like I said, even if externally nothing changes, you continue to provide or not provide the support. Getting clearer on the whys just helps feel more aligned, helps feel more in touch versus these automatic decisions and behaviors, kind of like the life examined. And so taking that time to examine it a little bit more closely, especially if you're not in a crisis or if you're in between crises, and get really clear on that. So again, no perfect answer to this, no way you have to do it, but I really would encourage taking a deeper look at the why as sort of the energy behind the situation. So we spend a lot of time talking about the who and the where and the what kind of care, but there's no energy in that situation until you get to the why. And you can kind of feel these situations. I feel them as a clinician being, exposed to so many different family systems and care ecosystems. I can feel the energy in it. If it's very positive and productive and like high affection, or if it's very obligatory, energy is different in the relationships. And all of them are possible and in the range of what happens in normal human relationships. And it could vary even between a couple. And your whys may change for one person over time. Your whys may be very different, like it was for my grandfather versus my grandmother. You probably couldn't get more polar opposite as to the whys. That's part of why I had this podcast, was my own internal recognition of how vastly different my reaction was to these two biologically important people. I just have always found that dichotomy very interesting. And that's, again, one of the main reasons that I love having these conversations. So I'm jumping in here. Sorry, I edit these podcasts on my own, and I've really struggled with this one. I've edited, I don't know, half of it out, and it still sounds kind of choppy to me. But anyway, I realized what I thought was missing was a more thorough discussion of some of the other quote unquote whys related to caring for an aging parent. Now, I know the affection and duty scale doesn't cover completely every single part of your why, or even once you sit down and get still and really start to understand the why, there might just be some really pragmatic things that bubble up that maybe have nothing to do with affection or duty. And I wanted to review a few of those. So one of those could just be financial considerations. It could be, frankly, just too expensive for the family to afford the level of care that person needs. And so other people might be brought into the care ecosystem regardless of affection or regardless even of duty, or maybe it's a duty to save money or conserve financial resources. So anyway, That is the why, and we will move on next week to the how. Well, I think the whole podcast is the how, but we're going to summarize it. All right. Thank you so much for listening.